So I'm doing the Nesterhoff video blog, and that is on chapter 1 of Nesterhoff, the comedians, Cliff Nesterhoff. Chapter 1 was vaudeville comedians. Um, so it starts with talking about how the United States had close to 5,000 vaudeville theaters, which is said on page 1. But it just starts off with the history of how vaudeville kind of came into being and talks about Benjamin Franklin Keith and his oddness, I guess. It was talking about taking like premature babies and showing them off. But I think throughout the whole chapter, I feel like the point of it was to say how flawed vaudeville was for just the fact that it was extremely flawed. Like, a lot of the people who were in charge, including Edward Albee, and yeah, mostly Edward Albee, was just an awful human being who tried to get money out of any situation but paid his workers poorly, and was kind of messed up. Like, for example, he was criticized by, and then also Benjamin Franklin Keith and Edward Albee had like a circuit at one point, and Variety was the show business paper of record, and when it dared publish objective criticism of Keith Albee shows, Albee banned Variety from his property. So that's pretty crazy. And that was said on page 2. But it goes through the history of Keith Albee and then talks about each problem within vaudeville. So it talks about just corrupt infrastructures, child labor, opiate addictions, alcoholics. Then it goes to define vaudeville comedians versus burlesque comedians, and how vaudeville comedians kind of were more, although lower class, they were more high class than burlesque comedians, because literally burlesque comedians were in burlesques, so they were with naked women and basically just telling jokes, which didn't really, people who were there were looking at the naked women rather than the jokes that people were doing. And on page 7 it says burlesque comedy was risque while vaudeville had pathological sanctimony. Vaudeville houses posted warnings backstage about verboten subject matters. References to sex or Christianity were out, as was any cussing. And that had a lot to do with Keith and Albee. One of the reasons is that it was by parishioners, I think that's how you say it, that they were told that vaudeville was bad and ungodly, basically, and the only way that they could do anything about it was by making it cleaner. And that had a lot to do with Albee's wife as well, who was very religious. Let's see. But the thing about the Keith Albee rules, which is what it's called, the arbitrary Keith Albee rules carried over into post-vaudeville media. Vaudeville died in the early 1930s. Keith Albee restrictions still inform the censorship bureaus of radio. That's on page 7, which is what happened while vaudeville was declining, radio was increasing. But then it talks about also just the cruel things that happened, like the hook and throwing rotten vegetables, and then they even talk about this thing called the hoop, and talk about and then they also talk about how there were children performers, and how, I actually didn't know this, but that the Marx Brothers were were children performers. But like the only ones that I ever knew about was like Groucho and Harpo Marx. So that's a lot interesting too. And then it talks about some of the like popular sketches, including the schoolroom sketch, and also just the straight man and the funny person acts, and it's just a lot about like specific people, including the Three Stooges. It talks a lot about like specific actors, comedians in vaudeville. So it was kind of just doing that a lot near the end, and then goes on to talk about the decline from vaudeville to radio, and also talking about how vaudeville kind of transcended into like theater, basically, like with the Follies, with the Ziegfeld Follies, and just how basically vaudeville was extremely problematic. People were racist, people were greedy, people were alcoholics or addicts. And I guess one of my questions would be, what exactly, because in the Johnson article, they talk about how the death of vaudeville was movies that had words in them, but this is saying radio. So I'm kind of confused as to what the disconnect is. And also, how was Charlie Chaplin in all of this? It's like Charles Chaplin is mentioned at one point, but I didn't really understand how he was in all of this. On page 16 was the like one mention of him. And yeah, it's just, this article is pretty, or not article, but this chapter is pretty telling of what exactly vaudeville was and what we don't learn about usually when we learn about vaudeville.